So, we've been talking a lot recently on this channel about who Naruto is as a character and how he fits into the fabric of his own story. Specifically, this talking point came up when Swag Kage made his storied return back to YouTube a couple of weeks ago, and he posted the video that Naruto was always the underdog, to which I did a reaction. In that video, a large piece of the conversation did surround Gaara, and one of the key points I made in my reaction is that Gaara does a better job embodying the core message of Naruto than Naruto. See, because Gaara is the foil to Naruto, a child thrust into a very similar situation as Naruto, who doesn't necessarily have the willpower or the support system to pull him out of it as a child. Both Naruto and Gaara are the children of the Kage of their village. They were both made Jinchuriki of tailed beasts as infants, and they both suffered in their childhood because of that fact. The key difference, however, between Naruto and Gaara is that Gaara was being trained to be a weapon, while Naruto was just being thrown away. On top of this, while Naruto was born with no real support system, Gaara was born with a support system. However, Gaara's support system either kept him at arm's length because they were terrified of him, or died in an assassination attempt against him. And thus, I'm not going to sit here and say either Gaara or Naruto had a harder childhood. It was Gaara. In actuality, the most important thing to consider here is that both of their childhoods were very similar, and therefore Gaara and Naruto represented the two possible outcomes of what could happen to a child thrust into a situation like this. However, how their story starts is not the only similarity between Gaara and Naruto, as they both effectively accomplish the exact same thing, with Gaara becoming the Kase-Kage and Naruto becoming the Hokage. However, the key difference between these two is that Gaara is able to accomplish this goal a whole decade before Naruto, and he does it mostly through his own power. And this is why I find Gaara to be one of the most complex and interesting characters in all of Naruto, which is why it's absurd that recently over an email it was pointed out to me that I've never done a you-know-nothing about Gaara, which is why today we're rectifying that mistake, because today we're talking you-know-nothing about Gaara. But before I get to telling you about the things that you may or may not know, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. So, Gaara's life is a complex one, filled with highs and lows, ups and downs, and trials and tribulations that you may not know about. I mean, sure, everybody remembers the Naruto versus Gaara fight, but do you remember really why Gaara was selected as the Jinchuriki of Shukaku? Do you remember the event that made him tattoo kanji into his forehead that he later changed? Do you understand how and why Gaara's mother is able to live inside of his sand and protect it? Well, he's a lot of people's favorite character. A lot of people don't have these answers, which is why today we're going to start this video off in the way that we tend to start these kinds of videos off, at the beginning. And the beginning of today's story starts actually before Gaara was even born. See, because a lot of you probably know that Gaara had Shukaku sealed into him while he was still in his mother's stomach. And this massive presence of chakra was too much for his mother to give birth to, which eventually led to her death in childbirth. However, unfortunately, that's pretty much the end of most people's understanding of how Gaara came into this world. See, in actuality, the reason that Rasa decided to make this decision was because while Karura, who is Gaara's mother, was pregnant with Gaara, when Daimyo, who's technically in charge of all of the budgeting of the village hidden in the sand, decided to levy massive budget cuts to the funding of the Hidden Sand Village. Now, it's pretty well known that the Hidden Sand Village is the least profitable out of all of the villages. It has the smallest population, the smallest army, and the weakest economy. And pretty much anything and everything that happens in the Hidden Sand Village is because of these factors. Puppets are created and weaponized in the Hidden Sand because they don't have enough shinobi to fill out their armies in battles against larger, more powerful villages. Rasa uses his magnet release to control gold dust to pull as much gold into the city to fund it as possible, and Rasa wants to bolster the strength of the Hidden Sand Village by making one of his children into the Jinchuriki of Shukaku. And unfortunately, this decision isn't actually that bad of a choice from Rasa. Yeah, is using your own kids to try and be the Jinchuriki of Shukaku a little bit demonic, I guess, but it's literally no different from what Minato did. Yeah, you can say that Minato was sealing Kurama inside of Naruto because he thought that Naruto was going to be the child of prophecy, but when you take even a step away from our Naruto-Minato bias, Minato decided to seal half of the most evil and most powerful tailed beast on Earth into his infant child because the guy who wrote Make Out Paradise told him that one time a giant frog, who rarely dreams, had a dream, and in that dream he trained the child of prophecy. And sure, you can say, well, Minato had no reason not to trust Jiraiya, but really, when it boils down to it, Minato had even less reasoning to inject Kurama into Naruto than Rasa did. On top of this, Gaara was not Rasa's Gaara's first choice. In fact, before trying to seal Shukaku into Gaara, Rasa tried with both Temari and Kankuro. And for those of you who are wondering, Temari's the oldest, Kankuro's the middle, Gaara's the youngest. But they're Irish triplets. They are all 1 year away from each other, so shout out to Rasa and Karura for getting after it. Anyways, only after seeing if Temari or Kankuro would be compatible with Shukaku did Rasa see if Gaara would be. And fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, upon testing the couple of months into its gestation period baby that was still in Karura's belly, did Rasa find that Gaara was compatible with Shukaku. And therefore, Granny Chiyo was brought into the mix. Yes, Granny Chiyo is the person who seals Shukaku inside of Gaara. And Granny Chiyo seals Shukaku inside of Gaara before he's even born. Now, unfortunately, the massive power and evil presence of Shukaku, now inside of Karura, led to complications in her pregnancy, and she eventually gave birth to Gaara massively premature. This is why Gaara is so small in Shippuden. Everybody thinks that Gaara is younger than everybody else in the Hidden Leaf when he participates in the Chunin exams. That's not the case. Gaara's 14 years old when he participates in the Chunin exams. He's just small. Mind you, Temari is 17 when she participates in the Chunin exams. Kinda makes the flirtatious banter between Shikamaru and Temari feel a bit different, doesn't it? Only gets worse when you consider the fact that during the time skip, Temari and Shikamaru really start floating towards each other. At which point, Shikamaru would be at the oldest 16 and Temari would be 19. Do with that as you will. Anyways, Gaara is born massively premature. Like, if you look at the images from either the manga or the anime of Gaara's birth, you can see that his entire body is literally smaller than Karua's head. But because of this, in the eyes of Karua, his mother, she gave birth to this fragile thing that desperately needed to be protected, because Karua didn't get to watch Gaara grow up. She passed away from complications in childbirth briefly after seeing this small, fragile life she had brought into existence, and knew in that moment that she had to do whatever she could to protect it. And thus, as she stared upon this premature baby, the third life she had brought into this world, she vowed in that moment to always protect Gaara. And thus, her soul, which we know exists in the Naruto universe, as souls go to the Pure Lands, and Dan, Tsunade's boyfriend, I guess, was able to send his soul out of his body into the sand that would protect Gaara for the rest of his life. And what's so interesting about this moment and the way that it's talked about is oftentimes Rasa is painted as the bad guy, and he kind of is, so it's not inaccurate. But you can see in the moment of Gaara's birth that not only is Rasa concerned about how tiny Gaara is, but he's also concerned about the idea of his wife's passing, as he's shaking doctors, telling them to do something to save her life. In fact, when Gaara and Rasa meet again in chapter 547 of the manga, Gaara even tells Rasa that he understands why Rasa tried to kill him 6 separate times, because Gaara understands that as a Jinchuriki, he was an actual threat to the village, a threat that Rasa, as the Kazekage, had the right and the obligation to destroy. And we can see in conversations that Rasa has with Yashamaru that Rasa, prior to sending Yashamaru to assassinate Gaara, tells Yashamaru to bring up Gaara's mother, Karua, because Rasa knows that Gaara still has love for his mother, and therefore, if Gaara can hear his mother's name and not go berserk, Rasa will understand that Gaara has the emotional stability to be a Jinchuriki that's trusted to live within the confines of the Hidden Sand Village. But unfortunately, when Gaara realizes that he killed Yashamaru, and Yashamaru tells Gaara about how he was named Gaara as a symbol of his mother's hatred towards the world, which is not what Yashamaru was told to do by Rasa, mind you, Gaara rather understandably loses it and starts rampaging in the middle of the hidden sand. And thus Rasa identifies Gaara as useless and once again has to suppress his Shukaku rage. Now you might be saying, Nick, we're doing a lot more talking about Rasa than we are about Gaara, and you're right, we are. Currently, at least, because it's important to understand exactly what Gaara's situation was before we make an assessment of who he was as a character. Gaara was loved. He was loved by Kankuro, Temari, Rasa, his family that he was raised with. However, because of external factors like the Wind Daimyo cutting funding to the Hidden Sand Village, Rasa as the Kazekage had to make a decision that he believed would lead to the continuance of the Hidden Sand's existence. A decision that he deeply regretted, as it netted him absolutely nothing that he could use as a weapon in Gaara and the loss of his beloved wife. And understanding this is important because while obviously a lot of the blame for Gaara's upbringing does fall on Rasa's shoulders, the key difference between Naruto and Gaara's childhood is not the support systems that they had. Naruto had people like Iruka, Hiruzen, Jiraiya, Kakashi, all watching out for him from the shadows. And while they may not have been as directly involved in Naruto's life as people like Rasa, Kankuro, Temari, and even Yashamaru were involved in Gaara's life, the real key difference between Gaara and Naruto is willpower. Gaara is placed in terrible situation after terrible situation, just like Naruto, but Gaara came out different than Naruto. Even though, while in his early life he was raised in isolation, he was taught ninjutsu by his father and kept company by his maternal uncle, Yashamaru. Gaara had a connection to his father and a actual caretaker, things that Naruto did not have, at least so far as we know. We don't really know what happened in the early days of Naruto's life. However, when Gaara, like Naruto, would roam around the village and try to make friends or assist people in the errands that they were running, the villagers of the Hidden Sand Village would essentially run from him, as they were terrified of the idea of the level of power that he could access as the Jinchuriki of Shukaku. And while this fear is certainly less justified than it is in Konoha, as we don't know if the Hidden Sand has a track record of Shukaku breaking out of its Jinchuriki prior to Gaara, as we really only know about one Jinchuriki prior to Gaara, and that was Bunpuku, and both him and Shukaku lived inside of a teapot together for like 80 years. And while we are told that the second Kazekage, Shamon, would do science experiments on Shukaku to reverse engineer the magnet release that Shukaku had that he would later invent and that the third Kazekage would later perfect with his iron sand technique, we still don't know whether or not that ever led to Shukaku breaking out and destroying large swaths of the Hidden Sand Village. However, the Hidden Sand Village does, like every other village, have a storied history of hating Jinchuriki and their respective tailed beasts. This is why Bunpuku and Shukaku were both sealed inside of a teapot for the entirety of Bunpuku's natural life. And thus, basically anybody that Gaara ever tried to get close to as he wandered around the Hidden Sand Village ran from him in some capacity or another, both the adults and the children. And when Gaara tried to assure them that he meant no harm, almost reflexively, he would use his sand to try to reach out to them. However, when he considered the fact that Gaara's only interaction with his Kazekage father had been training in ninjutsu, the only thing that Gaara was trained to do with the sand was to kill. And therefore, when Gaara tried to reach out to people to assure them that he meant no harm, oftentimes he would either injure or kill the person he was trying to reassure. Now, mind you, that wasn't Gaara's mother's sand he was using to injure these other children or adults. Gaara's mother's sand only acts defensively. The sand that he was using was the sand that Shukaku was allowing him to control. See, because the only reason that Gaara is able to control sand in the first place is because of the blessing he receives from Shukaku. Well, at least after he's done being a Jinchuriki. While he's the Jinchuriki of Shukaku, he gets to control sand because he's the Jinchuriki of Shukaku. And thus the reason that Gaara seemingly had no control over the sand that he was trying to use to reassure people is because he really didn't. It wasn't Gaara 100% directing the power and direction of this sand. The influence in the power of Shukaku was always invested every single time Gaara needed to move any sand that wasn't moved defensively. And thus, in a much larger sense than Naruto, Gaara was set up to fail. We don't see any leakage of Kurama's chakra into Naruto's body until Naruto is battling against Haku in the Land of Waves arc. And yet, every single time that we see Gaara use sand as a child, that is only because of his connection to Shukaku, which to me at least proves that there is a much more persistent connection between Gaara and Shukaku than there is between Naruto and Kurama. Now, this could be because of the demeanors of Shukaku and Kurama, but I believe it's more likely because of the different Fuinjutsu used on Gaara and Naruto, as Gaara had Shukaku sealed inside of him, most likely using something akin to the curse marks that appear on his body by Granny Chiyo, while Kurama was sealed inside of Naruto with what is essentially the most powerful Fuinjutsu on Earth, created by the Uzumaki, who were eradicated because they were too good at Fuinjutsu. On top of this, Gaara didn't understand the pain he was inflicting on other people because Gaara didn't feel pain until the Chunin exams. See, well, yes, Kuru's soul living inside of Gaara's sand is absolutely a blessing in a lot of senses. It stopped Gaara in a very literal sense from ever experiencing any physical pain as a child. If he tripped, a bed of sand would appear under him. If he was gonna bonk his head on a cabinet, sand would stop him. And thus Gaara would inflict this pain onto people, but never understand what exactly they were going through. And thus at 6 years old, he had to have Yashamaru explain to him what pain was. And from that explanation, Gaara realized that he did know what pain was, but not really in the physical sense. As while talking to Yashamaru, Gaara said that he does feel pain, this incredible agony that exists within his heart. However, unfortunately, Yashamaru illustrated to Gaara that he actually doesn't understand what pain is. See, because pain can be cured with rehab and medicine, but emotional pain can only be cured with love. And thus Gaara was stuck with an affliction that he had no cure to. He was a weapon created against his will, who now existed as a literal detriment to the cause he was supposed to bolster. The village was terrified of him, and his family wanted him dead. There were genuinely no avenues in which Gaara could ever find love. However, upon hearing this message from Yashamaru, Gaara was incentivized to go give more love to the people that he harmed. But Gaara, as a 6-year-old, didn't understand why he was treated with so much hate and vitriol. And while on a self-exploratory mission to try and figure out why everyone looked at him as a monster, he was attacked by a Suna Anbu. However, Gaara, who at this point was nearly as strong as any Chunin or Jonin, reflexively stopped the attack, turned around, and fatally injured the Anbu who was trying to kill him. He then walked up to the Anbu member because, mind you, at this time, he's trying to figure out why everyone treats him like a monster, and unmasked him with the idea of asking him why he attacked him. He's only a child. And it's in this moment that Gaara realizes that the person he's now fatally wounded is probably the only person who ever could have loved him. Yashamaru. And thus Gaara pleaded Yashamaru for an explanation why you, the only person who ever had anything even close to love for me, would try to kill me. To which Gaara responded that it was a mission given to him by Rasa, that the Suna Council, that mind you, includes a lot more people that are not Rasa. In fact, the Suna Council is a group of 12 members that make all of the decisions for Suna moving forward based on what they believe is the best possible course of action. And it's them who decide that Gaara is a lost cause and therefore needs to be eradicated. Now, a couple of you might be asking, well, okay, if the daimyo funds the Hidden Sand Village and the Suna Council makes all the decisions, what does the Kazekage do? And the answer is not a lot. He enacts the decisions and acts as the head of the army, but we really can't put a lot of what happened to Gaara on Rasa's shoulders. I mean, we could put some, but not all of it. And thus Yashamaru, with his dying breath, told Gaara about how the Suna Council decided that Gaara is currently a bigger threat to Suna than he is an asset. And in these final moments, Gaara tried to take solace in the fact that the one person who loved him on Earth was directed to kill him and didn't do it of his own volition. But Yashamaru had other ideas. See, Yashamaru was told by Rasa, when Rasa directed him to assassinate Gaara, to bring up Karua to see if it would break Gaara's mental. As Rasa understood that if Gaara has love for one thing and one thing alone left on this Earth, it's Karua. Now, I don't think Rasa told Yashamaru to tell Gaara that his mother never loved him and that his mother called him a self-serving carnage, which is what Gaara kind of means in Japanese, so that Gaara would be a curse upon Suna for what it did to her, but that's what Yashamaru ended up telling Gaara. Now, obviously, this was done as a test to see if Gaara would lose control of Shukaku and Shukaku would burst out of him to prove to Rasa once and for all that Gaara doesn't have the mental fortitude to be a Jinchuriki. But Yashamaru didn't mean any of this. Karua loves Gaara very deeply, so much so that she literally gave up on the idea of going to the Pure Land so she could stay with Gaara to protect him as living sand. On top of this, Yashamaru also loved Gaara very deeply, as Gaara reminded him of his sister. And in a sense, I do actually believe that Yashamaru did want Gaara dead, but not because Yashamaru held ill will towards Gaara, but rather because Yashamaru understood that killing Gaara may be a mercy, which is why in Yashamaru's final moments, as he was talking to Gaara, he opened his vest up and revealed he was wearing explosive tags, at which point he said to Gaara, "Please die," and exploded himself with a violence that shook the entire Hidden Sand Village. However, ironically, because of the defensive sand of his mother, Gaara was uninjured, unscathed, and in that moment, Gaara was robbed of the one person on Earth who took the time to love him. See, I do genuinely believe that Yashamaru was trying to do this as a pity to Gaara, as Yashamaru understood now that he was gone, there was nobody left on Earth to even try to course correct Gaara, that the assassination attempts would only get more brutal, and that was the case. 5 more times Rasa would try to assassinate Gaara, and I genuinely believe Yashamaru was trying to spare Gaara from that reality. But in this moment where Gaara was stripped of the one person who loved him, he was left with a ringing message in his ear that Yashamaru told him as he died, that the sand that protected him was a product of Shukaku and not Karua. And in that moment, Gaara, because of Yashamaru's lie, realized that he couldn't even rely on the love of his mother, the thing that he believed had been keeping him safe his entire life. And thus from that moment on, Gaara decided that he would live for himself and himself alone moving forward, that he would live up to the namesake of his own name and be a self-loving carnage. And thus in that moment, he etched the kanji for love, I, into his forehead as a reminder that he would be the only person to give himself love. And after that moment, he turned into Shikaku and raged into the center of the Hidden Sand Village, only to be stopped by his father's gold dust technique. And while over the next couple of years, Rasa would organize 5 more separate assassination attempts, Gaara's self-sufficiency and commitment to only loving himself slowly but surely turned him into the weapon Rasa wanted him to be, until eventually Rasa realized that Gaara did have some inherent worth, which is where the plan for the Chunin exams came from in the first place. And thus it was with this mentality that Gaara entered the Chunin exams, a place where for the first time he felt things like physical pain, but also a place where for the first time He felt what it felt like to be understood, to be appreciated, to be seen as a person and not a weapon. Gaara's connection with Naruto is obviously very important. You know that. But what Naruto taught Gaara wasn't love. Yes, Gaara, because of his interaction with Naruto, learned to love Naruto, and that cured the agony in his heart. But that's not the lesson that Naruto taught Gaara in their historically incredible fight. No, in that moment, Naruto snapped Gaara out of the lesson he taught himself on the night of Yashamaru's death. The idea that nobody would ever be able to understand, appreciate, or even love him. See, because while we can sit here and say that Naruto was the finger that knocked down the first domino, truly the most important thing that allowed for Gaara to turn into the model citizen that he became was a support system that Gaara already had heading into the Chunin exams. See, what Gaara didn't realize as a child is that his family loved him, but Rasa had an unfortunate but political obligation to eliminate him as a threat, and Kankuro and Temari were kept at such long arm lengths away that they were never able to get close enough to Gaara to truly show him that they mattered to them. But Naruto's interaction with Gaara in a very real and also metaphorical way allowed for Gaara to let down his walls. This is symbolized not only by the fact that Gaara lets people like Kankuro, Temari, and Naruto into his life, but also symbolized by the fact that Naruto ends this fight by landing a clean headbutt on Gaara, and what is the first instance of a non-transformed Gaara, at least his body, being struck without the defense of sand stopping it. Yes, we see a transformed Gaara when he's turning into Shikaku get kicked by Naruto and Sasuke. Yes, we hear that the Chidori cuts Gaara and he freaks out about his blood. And yeah, Rock Lee breaks the sand armor around Gaara's body, but this headbutt that Naruto lands on Gaara's unconscious body that's sticking out of Shikaku is the first time that we see a clean blow delivered to Gaara. And the beauty of this moment is there's really no reason that Karua's sand shouldn't have stopped Naruto. And therefore, the subcontext of this moment is that Gaara's mother realizes that Naruto is trying to do what's best for Gaara, and thus in this moment is defending Gaara by not defending him. And while you may say
that Gaara Sands never protected him after he started turning into Shikaku,
I personally like this explanation more because it serves to prove that what Yashamaru said was not true. There is a distinct difference between the sand that Gaara controls with Shukaku's power and the sand that Karua controls to defend Gaara. And that difference is perfectly highlighted in Gaara's battle against Naruto. But then again, what do I know? I've only thought about getting Gaara's forehead tattoo like 36 times because I love him so much as a character. Maybe I've completely misdiagnosed anything that was going on in his life. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Has hearing what I've had to say about Gaara changed your perspective on him as a character at all? Has it changed what you think about his upbringing, or maybe even the family system that he had as he was being raised in the hidden sand? Or do you feel the same way about Gaara as you always have? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I gotta go on a 5-mile run. This hunter exam is gonna win itself.